So
Okay.
tonight we have John Callender from Aberdeen, and who's now part of us really, because this is the second time you've presented for us. The first time was giving us a extremely thought-provoking presentation about free will and responsibility and the prison population and where we ought to go with that. And free will and responsibility is a theme which has been part of your academic and clinical life, I think, isn't it, John? And written
That's
a book
correct.
of that title as part of the International Perspectives in Philosophy and Psychiatry, if anyone wants to have a look at that. You've had a long-standing interest in medical humanities, I noticed, and I think are now retired from the NHS in,
That's right. Yeah, it's from
yeah,
September last year.
right, right. But thank you very much for agreeing to come back to an old topic of yours, which is
Hmm.
about aesthetic judgment and psychotherapy. Um, the usual routine here is that we aim to finish round about 8:15, thereabouts, sometimes a little later than that. If people could keep themselves on mute during the actual presentation, and then we'll have a decent period, hopefully, to have a conversation about what was being presented at the end of the meeting, and we can go from there. Tonight is going to be a bit of a two-person act, this, because John, you'll just have to signal to me when you want the next slide, and we'll go from there.
Okay.
Okay, so shall I? Hopefully, I can get. Can everyone see that?
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
that's
great,
that's
David.
good. Well done.
Just to highlight, Ian, you've still got your mic on. If you could mute yourself, that'd be grand, just so it's not coming through.
Right, am I good to go?
Hmm. Okay, yes.
Okay, well, tonight's title is Aesthetic Judgment and Psychotherapy. As David said, this is an old topic that I've come back to, and he also said if I'm disinterested in free will and responsibility, and I have a general sense that free will, moral responsibility, art are topics that are overlapping and interacting with each other, and I'd like to sort of develop this in terms of how all this comes together. So can we have next slide, please, David?
I do hope so. Um, Hang on. Oh, hang on. Next.
Just some acknowledgements. Some of this work was supported by the Wellcome Trust. Mike Hennessy was an art therapist at Cornhill, as was Alison Ram. Mike unfortunately died a few years ago. Eric Matthews was my supervisor, and many of you will remember Eric. He again died a few years ago. He was a professor of moral philosophy in Aberdeen for many years and a stalwart supporter of the philosophy and psychiatry movement. Okay, next slide, please, David. So the questions I want to look at this evening are firstly, what is the nature of aesthetic judgment? Secondly, why is this important in psychotherapy? Thirdly, how do aesthetic judgments change? And if we can answer these three questions, we can deal with a couple of subsidiary questions. One, what is the nature of art? And secondly, what is the meaning of life? Aha. Right, next slide, please. So what does psychotherapy do? This is a quotation from a paper by Bruin and Mick Kerr. Mick Kerr was a professor of psychology in Edinburgh for many years. All psychological therapies share a commitment to transforming the meanings that clients have attached to their symptoms, relationships, and life problems. So next slide, please. So when we have thoughts about things or propositions about ourselves or the world, what's the nature of these? I think until we sort that out, we can't begin to approach how we bring about changes in the beliefs and behaviors of our patients. And roughly one can divide propositions into those that are logical, those that are empirical, then there are moral judgments, and finally, aesthetic judgments. Next slide, please. So logical propositions, well, these are justified by applying the rules of logic, i.e. the proper relations between propositions, for example. Deductive reasoning, and this comes out in simple syllogisms like, oh, men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. It also applies to other sort of a priori ways of thinking, like mathematics. And the next slide, please, David. Then we have empirical judgments, and these rest on some kind of experiential validation. For example, if I say I weigh 80 kilograms, I'll verify that by stepping on the scales. At a more elevated level, we have empirical research. If we want to assert that, for example, a drug is an effective treatment for schizophrenia, we have to set up something like a randomized controlled trial, and then we judge the outcome of that trial based on its adherence to methodology, its use of statistics, interpretation, and so on. And probably the major school of psychotherapy is now cognitive behavioral therapy, that was derived to some extent from what was called rational emotive therapy. And the basic idea with cognitive therapy in its original form is that patients get their empirical judgments wrong, that they, for example, overinterpret negative occurrences, that they downplay positive occurrences, that they don't reason in a logical kind of way in terms of how they assess what these judgments mean to them. They end up with automatic negative thoughts, to use the jargon term, and a very negative cognitive set. Okay, next slide, please. Then there are moral judgments. For example, it's wrong to hunt foxes, or murder is a sin, and we validate these with reference to moral philosophy, for example, Kantianism, utilitarianism, or those of religious bents, given sets of rules like the Ten Commandments. And this is, I think, very appropriate to psychotherapy as well, but that's another topic that I might do if there's another gap in the program. Okay, next slide, please. And finally, aesthetic judgments. For example, this painting, film, photograph, poem, song, symphony is either priceless or worthless, beautiful or ugly, original, derivative, interesting, boring, honest, sentimental, noble, or vulgar. I think this is important. I mean, we spend a lot of our time in the world of aesthetic experience looked at broadly. By that, I don't mean just going to the opera or an art gallery, but, reading novels, watching drama on television, and so on. This occupies, several hours each day of our lives. It consumes a substantial chunk of our gross domestic product. So I think it's worth looking at, what this means, how does it come up in psychotherapy, and what the implications of that might be for psychotherapy. So next slide, please, David. This was set out in a formal way, first of all by Immanuel Kant, described for that reason as the father of modern aesthetics. And the work in question is the critique of judgment, latterly translated as the critique of the power of judgment. The two translators of this latest version were Paul Guyer and also Eric Matthews, who I mentioned earlier. Eric said this was about the most wearisome task he'd ever undertaken. And if you try to read this book, you'll well understand why. It's the third of Kant's great critiques, and followed the critique of pure reason and the critique of practical reason. And Kant hoped that this would be the one that unified his so-called critical philosophy. I think there's considerable disagreement as to whether he achieved that. But nevertheless, I think agreement that he did make a number of penetrating observations about the nature of art and aesthetic judgment. So he argued aesthetic judgment is a particular type of judgment with its own justifications, and that this will form a major part of our response to a work of art, but also to other objects of perception, for example, a beautiful view. So we divided aesthetic judgment into four characteristics or moments, as he called them. Can we have next slide, please, David? The first is disinterestedness, and he said the aesthetic judgment's based on an emotional reaction of pleasure arising from contemplation of the object, and this pleasure arises principally from beautiful form. The desires, aims, and ambitions of the observer should be laid aside. So I might enjoy having a painting for a famous artist because I think that displays my wealth and good taste and so on, but that's nothing to do with aesthetic judgment. Aesthetic judgment is purely of the work itself. Next slide, please. By formalisms, the importance of form versus content. We often say it's not the jokes, it's the way you tell them. It has been argued that beautiful form is characterized by unity and internal coherence. It's a quotation from a book by Malcolm Budd. When in general value, exemplified by many fine musical works, is the unification of diverse materials, the harmonious reconciliation of multiplicity within a unity, so-called unity in diversity or organic unity. And if you go to something like the opera or the ballet, you expect to see the different elements coming into a harmonious role. In the case of dance, for example, choreography, costume design, music, set design, story, and so on should all come together to make something. Also applies in thinking about photography. Could I have the next slide, please, David? It's a photograph of taken in Valencia at a place called the City of Art and Sciences, designed by a very famous Spanish architect called Santiago Calatrava. And could I have the next slide, please? There are proponents of black and white photography, and the main argument for the superiority of black and white is that it allows you to focus on the form of the painting, the composition, the formal structure of the building, and so on. Okay, next slide, please. Second characteristic is universality, and this highlights a paradox of aesthetic judgment. Firstly, aesthetic judgments are based essentially on an emotional reaction, not on a concept or concepts of the object, but they also lay claim to the agreement of other subjects of experience. Kant said artistic genius is a talent for producing that for which no determinate rule can be given. And we see this in how we think about art. There are many prizes for artistic products like the Oscar Awards for films, the Booker Prize for long form fiction. Now, nobody can lay out the precise criteria about what makes a novel a great novel or a better novel than another novel, or what makes a great film, a great film rather. But we have a sense that there is more to the judgment of art than just a myriad of subjective emotional reactions to it. And this is what makes art important at a personal level. If you came to my house for dinner one night, I might offer you some olives with your glass of wine. If you say you don't like olives, well, who cares? I'll offer you some crisps instead. If I decide to show you my new painting, and it turns out you don't like my new painting, that's going to upset me quite a lot. Okay, next slide, please. Leading on from universality is an idea of necessity that we should agree with each other's judgments. And one element of this is that aesthetic characteristics of a work of art have only a sort of as if objectivity. If I say that my painting was painted in 1850, that's an objective statement about this work of art. If I say it's beautiful, then I'm not really describing the work of art at all. I'm describing myself, how I happen to feel about this. This is based on the principle of intersubjectivity or common sensibility, Gemeinsinn in German. When we discuss a work of art, we discuss how we perceive it, not its objective characteristics. I think it's probably truer to say that there are common sensibilities, and it's quite interesting how social groups often cohere around a shared aesthetic sensibility. So you might get the heavy metal youth who like this kind of stuff, who socialize with each other. You might get those who are more interested in freeform jazz, and maybe it's not just a shared interest, but the fact one likes one form of art rather than another says something about just how your brain is wired up, the things you react to, the way you deal with stimuli that are coming at you. Another part of necessity is the importance of communicability. So art can only communicate something if there is some kind of common sensibility in how we approach it. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, the next slide, please. And one of the most enigmatic but important aspects of aesthetic judgment is what we call purposiveness without purpose. I've illustrated it with this painting, which is in the Uffizi in Florence. It shows a 7-year-old girl called Bianca, who was the daughter of Cosimo de' Medici. She's actually the illegitimate daughter, which makes it perhaps a little surprising that she's the subject of such a beautiful and presumably very expensive painting. Now, you could say, well, what purpose does a painting like this serve? Well, it shows a love of a father for his daughter. The medallion round her neck actually includes a portrait in profile of Cosimo de' Medici. If you were a Marxist, you would say that it's designed to show the wealth and power of this family, and she is beautifully dressed. She has a ring of pearls round her neck. One interesting aspect is the blue pigment in the background. In the Renaissance, the romantic idea of the artist as the lone genius scarcely existed. A painting like this would actually be the product of a very detailed contract between the patron and the artist. And one thing that would be specified in the contract is the quality of the pigments used. Now, after gold leaf, this blue pigment was about the most expensive pigment you could get hold of. It is made from a crystal called lapis lazuli, and it was mined in Afghanistan and then came over the sea to Italy. Which is why it's called ultramarine blue. So anyone looking at this picture would know that there's a young woman who's quite literally surrounded by the trappings of wealth and prestige. If you see pictures with Virgin Mary from the Renaissance, she'll nearly always be in a blue dress, and that serves the same purpose as a signifier of status and prestige. But having discussed all that, it seems somehow reductionist to take this down to its purposes. There's something about this painting that transcends this, and even more so when you learn that this girl died at the age of 8, shortly after this picture was completed, or may even have been dead by the time it was completed, and it was taken from a face mask. And it seems almost quite miraculous that she looks out at us from this beautiful portrait more than 500 years later. Okay, next slide, please. What happens if the work of art is used for an ulterior purpose? I think we'll just skip this, David. It could get us into all sorts of technical glitches, but the point I was going to make was if a work of art is used for an ulterior purpose, it can spoil it in some way. And the example I was going to use was a series of television adverts for Hamlet cigars. Now, some of the older members of the audience might remember these. The usual scenario with some middle-aged chap facing a irksome or difficult situation, and then he would light up a Hamlet cigar, and there'd be a piece of music which is a jazz version of Ear in a G String by Bach. And I actually have a recording of this at home. And every time I put it on, even years later, my first thought is the slogan of this advert, happiness is a cigar called Hamlet. So you could say this work of art has been spoiled or contaminated for me because of its co-optation or use for this ulterior purpose of advertising cigars. Anyway, this is where we've got to. This is from Paul Geyer, aesthetic judgment, the idea that in judgment of taste, a person can claim intersubjective validity for the feeling of pleasure that she experiences in response to a beautiful object because that pleasure is produced in an attitude of disinterested contemplation, not by a practical concern for utility or advantage in possession of the object, but by the free and harmonious play of the cognitive faculties of imagination, that understanding that the beautiful object induces, and that she can rightly claim such validity for her feeling because we all share these cognitive faculties and they must work pretty much the same way in all of us. Okay, next slide, please. The final element is the ethical or moral aspect of ethical judgment. And we often attribute an ethical dimension of art, and sometimes said beauty is a symbol of morality. And in the critique of judgment, Kant says some works of art arouse sensations that contain something analogical to the consciousness of a mental state produced by moral judgments. Quite difficult to know what to make of this, as some people probably know Kantian moral theory is very rational and cognitivist. And the idea here, I think, is that his aesthetic philosophy provides a kind of emotional counterpart to that strictly rational way of thinking about morals. Final quote on this slide is from the novelist William Boyd describing judging an art exhibition. Said, I scrutinized them first for any sign of expertise or virtuosity, second for any evidence of integrity and honesty. Next slide, please. Next quotations from David Hume. There's no spectacle so fair and beautiful as a noble and generous action. As the philosopher Smart said, when we praise moral qualities and moral actions in the same way as we praise beauty, intelligence, agility, or strength. And then Jonathan Glover, there can also be aesthetic responses to people's motives and character. If I'm a hard determinist, I can still admire someone's generosity as long as I accept that this is in part good luck. It will be like admiring someone's musical talent. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, we've just gone to some clinical vignettes, just 3 statements that were uttered by patients that I was seeing in my outpatient clinic. I think they're fairly typical of the stuff patients come out with, although they have been selected for this particular talk. The first one is a middle-aged woman receiving therapy, attempting to deal with the consequences of severe childhood sexual abuse. Feels completely worthless. The therapist mentions her many important achievements, to which she replies, yes, I see what you mean, but I still feel dirty and disgusting. Next slide. Young woman being seen as an outpatient for the treatment of postnatal depression. She's obsessed with the idea that she is a bad mother and that her child will be taken away from her. She's seen a psychologist for cognitive therapy, but said this of her treatment. I felt I could see through cognitive therapy. I could see what the psychologist, was trying to tell me, get me to think, but it didn't make any difference. I know I'm a bad mother, and no one will ever make me feel any different. Okay, next slide, please. There was a student being seen for the treatment of anorexia nervosa. Despite being underweight, she continues to complain that she's fat. So the therapist, that's me, shows her a body mass index chart and points out that far from being overweight, she is in fact underweight. She then says, yes, I can see what the chart shows, but I still feel that I'm fat and revolting. Okay, next slide, please. So in psychotherapy, we commonly make a distinction between emotional and intellectual judgments. A patient might say, yes, I can see the point of what you're trying to say at an intellectual level, but I don't get it emotionally. And this has sometimes been described as a contrast between hot versus cold cognition, or knowing with the heart versus knowing with the head. But how can you know with the heart? Beck said a person cannot believe anything emotionally. How do these emotional judgments acquire cognitive content? Or to put it differently, if one knows with the heart, then what kind of thing can be known, and how does one know it? Okay, next slide, please. Well, I think one solution to this dilemma is to look on these as aesthetic judgments of the self. Now, why do I say that? Well, firstly, I think they show the characteristics of universality, that firstly, they are subjective, they're based on emotion, but they claim the agreement of others. The sexual abuse survivor, for example, said, well, you know what happened to me, surely you find me dirty and disgusting. The anoretic young woman pinched a fold of skin in her thigh, said, look at that, surely you can see how fat I am. And secondly, necessity, this is based on an appeal to common sensibility or intersubjectivity, which I've kind of covered already. I think these are sort of overlapping concepts to some extent. And then there's disinterestedness and form. If you wanted to have one formula that would cover the range of mental disorders, you could say that there is a loss of unity and internal coherence. One of the pioneers of counselling, Carol Rogers, coined a phrase back in the 1950s of unconditional positive regard. This is something a therapist should have for the patient. So it's just a disinterested approbation of the patient, doesn't depend on any particular characteristics of the patient, and he felt this was an appropriate therapeutic stance to start with. Okay, next slide, please. Finally, there's purposiveness without purpose. I said I would talk about the meaning of life, so here it goes. So what's the meaning of life? Well, the bad news is no one has worked out the answer to that question, but the good news is no one cares very much. You know, we get through life, we get up, we go to work, we go to the golf course, we come to meetings of the speculative psychiatry group. Life just feels meaningful. You could say that, like the work of art, life has purposiveness without purpose. And what's happened to our patients? Well, we see in them a loss of that meaning and purposiveness. Our sexual abuse survivor had constant loss of meaning, loss of purpose. The anoretic girl had a life completely dominated by this need to control her food intake, to maintain a low weight. And I think what happens with these people is that they have been used earlier in life for the purposes of another person, and childhood sexual abuse, I think, is the prime example of this. When this happens, this can lead to a debased self-concept, spoiled, contaminated identity, and perhaps even suicidality. Another patient who was also a victim of sexual abuse just said it very succinctly, said, I'm not a person. And finally, there's the ethical dimension. The sexual abuse survivor felt very guilty. She thought that she had in some way provoked the abuse by her father. The woman with postnatal depression was very guilty. She thought she wasn't being a good mother to her daughter. She thought her depression was actually a punishment for having had a termination of pregnancy earlier in life. And the anorectic patient, like many anorectic patients, saw thinness and self-control as a sign of moral value. She had occasional binges and again saw that as lapsing into greed and self-indulgence. Okay, next slide, please. So just before this, when I was working this paper, there was some interesting work coming out in cognitive psychology. John Teasdale spoke about interacting cognitive subsystems. There was a propositional code for standard propositions about the nature of the world, and then an implicational code, which he said was for generic holistic meanings. I think this is probably what psychologists now call schemas. Okay, next slide, please. That implicational meanings are associated with different experiences of the self as subject, and attempts to convey such implicational holistic meanings by language have taken the form of poems, parables, and stories. And ICS restricts the capacity to elicit emotion to generic level meanings. More specific meanings, even if they have emotionally relevant content, cannot themselves elicit emotion. Next slide, please. These quotations are from Leslie Greenberg. He argues that we, spend a lot of time trying to make sense of our emotions, and said once contact with emotional experience is achieved, clients must also cognitively orient to that experience as information and explore, reflect on, and make sense of it. He spoke of symbolizing emotion in awareness and the creative construction of new meanings and narratives. Okay, next slide, please. So how do aesthetic judgments change? Well, I said these are not empirical judgments and therefore will not be amenable to the rational empirical discourse of traditional cognitive therapy. I think there's a need to focus on self as subject, not self as object. In terms of art, aesthetic judgment does depend to some extent on enabling knowledge. If you can't speak French, you're never going to understand French poetry, and a lot of understanding of art depends on knowing something about the culture, the history of the artwork itself, and this comes under art education and criticism. Okay, next slide, please. Interpretation is widely used in therapy and also in art. This is a quote from an art historian called Cynthia Freeland. An interpretation can even transform an experience of art from repugnance to appreciation and understanding. Next quote from Kant. Beautiful art displays its excellence precisely by describing beautifully things that in nature would be ugly and displeasing. Okay, next slide, please. So let's just do a bit of audience participation here. This is a picture also by Bronzino, as it happens. It's called An Allegory of Venus and Cupid. You maybe just take a few moments just to look at this picture and just form some ideas in your own mind about what you think about it or how you feel about it. Okay, we'll just go through an explanation then of what we're looking at here. The most obvious thing is this naked Venus or Sun Cupid engaging in a very unfilial caress of her breast and kiss on the lips. So this is a picture about incest and forbidden sexuality. On one hand, Venus is holding Cupid's arrow. I don't think it would take Sigmund Freud to work out the symbolism there. Cupid's buttocks are quite protuberant. There's a quiver of his arrow is strategically placed. It's been suggested that this is a symbol of sodomy. Now, that might be wildly overinterpreting the picture, but this kind of sexual allusion or joking was quite common in Renaissance painting. Can we have the next slide, please, David? Anyone recognise this? It's in the National Gallery in Edinburgh. It's a detail from a painting by Titian called The Three Ages of Man. The blurb in the gallery wall says that the Flutes are a symbol of the lyricism of love, but perhaps the location of them tells a different story here. Go back to the previous slide, please. Okay, and Venus has a golden apple in her left hand. Does anyone know how Venus got a golden apple? What's the so-called judgment of Paris? Three goddesses, Athena, Hera, and Venus offered Paris great prizes, and if he would give one of them his golden apple, and Venus offered him the most beautiful woman in the world, and this is the prize Paris selected. So Venus got her golden apple, and Paris got the woman who became Helen of Troy. And as we all know, that didn't end well. So this is a warning about what happens if you let your lustful desires get the better of your common sense. Right, top left in this painting, we have a masked figure who's trying to draw a veil over the whole shameful scene. But top right is Father Time. You probably can't see this, but he's got an hourglass on his shoulder, and he's got wings. Because time flies. Below him, we have this cherubic figure who's throwing rose petals over the scene, but again, you can hardly see it. His right foot has a big thorn through it, and gouts of blood are coming out. So there's a statement that behind the rose petal, there's always the thorn. And just at his right shoulder, this rather sinister looking young woman who is holding out a gift of a honeycomb. Does anyone see anything strange about this one? Well, it's a right arm, but this is a left hand, so suggesting this is a gift that is ambiguous or ambivalent, and she is not what she appears to be. She has the body of a lion and then the serpent tail, and there's a sting in this tail which she is trying to conceal with her other hand. That's in the middle of the right hand margin of the picture. And below the little boy, there are some masks that usually indicates deception, and then it's Cupid's right foot pigeons, which are supposed to represent chaste love that are being shoved aside rudely. Then finally, this figure with his head in his hands and this expression of pain on his face. Can we go forward 2 slides, please, David? This is where it gets interesting for this group. It's a screenshot from a letter in a journal called Sexually Transmitted Diseases. This figure's traditionally been described as representing jealousy, but this letter suggests it's actually representing syphilis. The dominant theory of where syphilis came from still seems to be the so-called Columbian theory that came back from the New World with Columbus's sailors and then spread throughout Europe. And this figure's said to show some symptoms. He's got a skin rash, he's got a headache, his sclera are inflamed. You can get uveitis or interstitial keratitis as part of the picture of secondary syphilis. You get a meningitis as well, which can cause headache and skin rash. Some of the features may be a result of mercury, which was commonly used to treat the condition. It's hard to grasp just how devastating syphilis was to people in the middle of the 16th century. It was first described and named as such around that time by an Italian physician. People were terrified of it. I suppose the closest we've got to it was the AIDS epidemic of 25 years ago. Another little possible nugget is that this picture was a gift from Cosmo de' Medici to the French king, who was a noted libertine, to use the language of the age. Syphilis was also known as the morbus gallicus, the French disease, so it may be that this figure was poking a stick in the eye of the French king. Okay, we just go back to the painting. So does anyone like to say just how that explanation changes the way they look at this painting, how they think about it? The way I'm describing it was the way it would probably be seen by a contemporaneous observer. Educated people at that time would be very well versed in classical mythology. You can also argue there's a bit of hypocrisy in the whole thing. It's ostensibly an argument against illicit sexuality, yet you could also regard it as a piece of high-class pornography. Right. Anyone like to say just what
I
they
was
think about
thinking,
it now?
I was just thinking that, I mean, you having given that account of it means that, I mean, I see more. I see a lot more than I
Mhm.
had before, and in that sense, that there is more there.
Mhm.
I'm trying to sort of tie up in my mind what you were talking about in the earlier on about the psychotherapy and the um, being in contact with oneself and other people, and being in contact with art. What the attention is changed by being by the insight that being better. It's not just information. It's more than that, isn't it?
Okay, any other reflections on that?
I suppose my initial impression was of chaos, and therefore any explanation reduces the sense of chaos. And that's a wee bit simplistic.
Mhm. Okay. I mean, this is we're hundreds of years before the advent of the moving picture. To tell a story like this, you had to pack a lot into just a single image. Okay, shall we move on? So skip the next two slides, David, onto the one after that. So a lot of what we do in therapy is something like this, just helping people to understand themselves, see their problems differently, reinterpret their thoughts, sometimes described as reframing, decentering, guiding discovery, and seeking to change these judgments. We are not trying to replace wrong judgments with correct ones, but rather to produce new perspectives, judgments that are more thoughtful, better informed, and complex. Okay, next slide, please. And art is increasingly moving away from the kind of photographic reproduction of the external world to trying to represent the inner world. This is a quotation from Matisse. I do not literally paint that table, but the emotion it produces upon me. Okay, next slides, please. This is a picture of Atlas by Guercino. He's a 17th century artist, and you can see that he's not just trying to, do a pictorial representation of Atlas, but just trying to convey this effort and the strain and the exhaustion that comes with it. And the next slide is a drawing of a head by German artist Joseph Beuys, and you see realism kind of increasingly giving way to an attempt to convey the emotions elicited within this, the emotions being experienced by the subject of this drawing. Okay, next slide. And finally, we come to something like this. This is by an American artist called Mark Rothko's so-called abstract expressionist. It's just about impossible to convey in a slide the impact or the intended impact of a painting like this. These are this is an example of Rothko's so-called color field pictures, which were usually large oblongs of color. They're big paintings. This one's about 6 feet by 4 feet, and Rothko always said you should stand up close. He said 18 inches away. Most people suggest 3 or 4 feet away so that it's filling a huge chunk of your visual field. It's much more complicated than it looks. It's sort of many layered, and if you're standing right beside this, you get this sense of three-dimensional enveloping gloom that your eye keeps getting caught by this band of orange above you, which may be what the last glimpse of a setting sun or a last glimpse of hope. This was painted during Roscoe's so-called dark period. There's not much imagination to that appellation. He was very depressed at this stage of his life. He eventually committed suicide by cutting into both antecubital foci, and this was helped along with an overdose of doxepin. So questions to think about: what is this a painting of? What's it depicting? Could I have next slide, please? David Mark Roscoe himself described these as portraits of states of the soul. Said, I'm only interested in expressing basic human emotions: tragedy, ecstasy, doom. A major collector of Roscoe was Duncan Phillips. In Roscoe, there's no pictorial reference at all to remembered experience. What we recall are not memories, but only emotions disturbed or resolved, some sense of well-being suddenly shadowed by a cloud, or the fire diminishing into a glow of embers, or the light when the night descends. So I think what Roscoe's doing is trying to just depict a state of mind, a state of consciousness, if you like, and moving away from the depiction of external reality completely. Okay, next slide, please. So what does art mean then? This quotation is from a Chris Janaway: aesthetic judgment is a capacity contained in the very fabric of human mentality. Next quotation is from Clifford Geertz. He's actually an anthropologist describing works of art. They materialize a way of experiencing, bring a particular cast of mind out into the world of objects where men can look at it. The next slide, please. It's another cryptic quote from Joseph Beuys: drawing is the first visible form in my works, the first visible thing of the form of the thought, the changing point from the invisible powers to the visible thing. It's really a special kind of thought brought down onto a surface, and everything now comes together. The thought becomes modified by other creative strata within the anthropological entity of the human being. I think what Joseph Beuys is saying here is that art becomes a kind of recursive thing. You put things down and then that feeds back, and the whole thing develops from there. Okay, next slide, please. So concluding, self-awareness, I think, is an aesthetic experience, perhaps the original aesthetic experience, and art is the externalization of that experience, and art therefore becomes one way in which we enhance, extend, fix, reflect upon, and communicate conscious experience. Next slide, please. Include aesthetic judgments are commonly encountered in psychopathology, and this has major implications for the type of dialogue that's required in psychotherapy. Aesthetic judgments won't be changed by the standard rational empirical dialogue of cognitive therapy. I think change also requires something akin to art criticism and history. Next slide, please. I think aesthetic philosophy brings together all the important stuff we deal with in psychotherapy: emotion, cognition, meaning, purposiveness, and ethics. Right, that's all from me. I'll throw the paper open to discussion.
Thank you very much, John. That was tremendous. Chris, you've got your hand up. Do you want to start the?
Sure. Thank you so much, John. I really enjoyed the paper and also your presentation. I think what really resonated for me, unsurprisingly, was the vignettes. in my own experience, kind of doing CBT, just as the case for my training, what was really striking was the patient saying, kind of rationally and cognitively, I get what you're saying. We're doing this work about, looking at evidence to challenge some of these beliefs. But I feel, I feel it. It's that emotional aspect, and how on earth do we sort of rationalize our way out of that? So I just wondered, it'd be really interesting to hear your thoughts. I mean, it's a big question, but how would that sort of play out? The need to try, I guess, for a non-empirical approach within therapy. How might that sort of play out? The idea of trying to reframe things, or to sort of to try to challenge or change some of those aesthetic judgments. How might that take place?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's evidence that just changing cognitions, that the level of rational thinking just doesn't help people much at all. It doesn't make them feel any less depressed and so on. And I think things like reframing are quite important. That, if you've got a sexual abuse survivor, just showing, well, this is, not, you don't feel these things or think the way you do because you're a crazy person. This is, what happens when people have had the kinds of experiences you have had. We often talk about the need to take ownership of our emotions and cognitions and so on as a first step to getting them under control. But you could equally argue we need to disown them. This is not me. This is something that's been inflicted on me by the traumatic experiences I've had in the past. And, I sometimes use the analogy of a computer virus, this low self-esteem. It's not you that you're describing. This is something that's been inculcated in you by, the way you were mistreated by your mother, or neglected by your father, or abused by someone else. And I think it comes under this sort of decentering, reframing, just trying to move it away from a personal thing to try and let the person take a broader, more detached view of what's going on in their mind.
Thank you.
David.
Many thanks, John. That was characteristically thought-provoking. In simple descriptive terms, psychopathologically, the examples you gave from the vignettes seem to be absolutely on the borderline between delusions and so-called overvalued ideas, or maybe there's a better term. But in the context you were describing, is that even a useful distinction?
Yeah, I mean, none of these patients is psychotic. I think they're all overvalued ideas. And in terms of getting a handle on what that means, I think aesthetic judgment is quite a good way of framing it, thinking about it, and dividing it up and getting some sense of what's going on here. Not sure that answers your question.
Indeed, thanks. It's
Yeah.
my instinct was, if one pressed really hard, there was insight there. And I wasn't sure there was a useful distinction. But as you say, trying to unpick and work usefully with overvalued ideas does seem a valuable approach.
Okay.
Gordon.
Gordon's got a hand up.
Well, Gordon hasn't worked out how to do the hand gesture in this. John, thank you very much for a really stimulating presentation. You said something that kind of just slipped through very, very quickly that I thought was very provocative, actually. Because you said, I think in the first half of your talk, life has purposiveness without purpose. Now, if I understand correctly, that's a pretty massive statement in a way, which I don't know how many people here would agree with you, but that's essentially saying it's purposive, but doesn't really have purpose, if I understood you. And I think relating that to what's been discussed already, in some ways, if we're talking about the difference that might make the difference, and we're recognizing, paraphrasing Einstein, that we can't solve a problem with the kind of thinking or the situation that created the problem. And what is it that we have to allow in that can allow us to or help our patients step out of the loop. And I think for some people that would be about love as something, and if we're working in a really embodied way, I mean, you mentioned at the end emotion, cognition, purpose, and ethics, but I think, we have to bring in the body. And some people, I think, might say that if there's going to be a difference that might make the difference, that has to be about love. And that lines up very much with what is the purpose of life. Now, of course, we can build up lots of defenses against love, and even the thought of close connection can constellate lots of defenses and pull us into the old patterns. But isn't that one way of thinking about what life is all about, to be able to connect to love, actively to love, but also to be able to, receive love? Can we not think of that as a purpose, or the purpose of life, to become more open in those terms, to be able to love and to be able to receive love? Blake's idea of we are put on earth for a little space to learn to bear the beams of love, as a sort of receptive relationship with love. And might that not be central to creating change in psychotherapy?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I'll have to give that some thought. I mean, my initial purpose is saying that you're not going to find some ulterior purpose to life by thinking about it. But despite that, it feels purposiveness, feels purposive. And one reason it feels purposive is if we can, live according to our own aims and purposes that are self-generated in some kind of authentic way, rather than being imposed on us, rather than being the kind of person who, for example, grew up with critical, unloving parents who constantly goes through life, seeking approbation, seeking approval from other people, and so on. I think the idea of love is very interesting in this context, and it has that unconditionality. That's, in a way, what love is. You don't love somebody because they're clever or good looking or whatever. There's something there that just transcends. It's disinterested, if you like. So yes, you planted a seed there, which I will take away and try and apply. And I think it's a very important one. Also very interested in the picture I see behind you as well. You could perhaps tell us a bit about that one.
My sister, it's a picture of my sister who's a professional artist and an Alexander teacher as well, but recently.
All right, okay. Good.
Sue Barclay, she's got a great website.
I don't know. I was also thinking of maybe just building on Gordon's point here, about some sort of relational dimension to what you're talking about the idea of judgment occurring between a self and another, and whether aesthetic judgment in psychotherapy is a form of attention that we are trying to cultivate, both sort of self to other, but also self to self, that there's a certain beauty to be apprehended within, and that this presumably, it just sort of sounds as though it's implied, John, about a certain ethic here, which is that we encounter our clients, patients, as objects of beauty, as something that can't be reduced in a simple way, or manipulated. But the task is sort of educative in the sense of trying to, like, when you took us through that painting, to see what you didn't see before. But in the language of encounter, that you've met something here. Like you meet, if you have an aesthetic experience in a theatre or in a sort of conventional aesthetic experience, it involves some sort of meeting and some sort of attention which you give rather than take. So there is a sort of core process, I think, in psychotherapy is a form of attentiveness, a sort of waiting for the other, which and like those art critics that you quoted, they are sort of telling us a little bit in words what their attention has been drawn to, but you still have to go back to the original And so an aesthetic judgment has, there's a sort of search for an originality somewhere. If it becomes unoriginal, you've lost something. But if you can see the originality and bring the originality to life, then something becomes much more real, and maybe that's the way to sort of get beyond a sort of superficial cognitiveness. You know, just this is just trying to change thoughts, and instead it's more about the language of encounter, I think. Yeah, so attention, maybe that's the thought I've got here. It's something about the cultivation of some sort of attention. And if that's what psychiatry is about, I mean, maybe mindfulness is a sort of revolt in that sense. It's trying to saying, well, come on, let's just sit with one another, because that's really an attend to oneself, and maybe that's a sort of thread that's that people are looking at now.
People are also looking for understanding as well. And sometimes it's a precious gift. There's the song by The Who, "Can you see the real me, Doctor?" You know, people want you to see the real me.
They have to, yes, but to see the real me, there has to be some sort of act of faith that there is something there to be seen, which maybe the clinician brings, even though they haven't yet seen it, if you see what I mean. There has to be a sort of openness. I think with the way Kant sort of drew, he sort of, in his very orderly way, doesn't he? Sort of, these are the components of aesthetic judgment. There's a certain sort of appeal to forms of attention, ethical, the purposefulness without purpose. That sounds more like sort of an attitude of unknowing. You sort of anticipate that there's something purposeful here, even if you can't quite. You could prematurely know it and name it, but we have to be careful about that. And the universality and the necessity, yeah.
Yeah, I was interested in the pictures and what we interpret from them. Mark Rothko just leaves me a bit cold because it doesn't come at you just seeing it fresh. You have to know that he's depressed, and you have to know the symbolism. It has to be explained, and so I can imagine how you get changed. But thinking about the oh, sorry, phone's gone off. Oh God. Sorry about that. I was thinking about the Zen garden in Kyoto. It's a famous one. It's got about 15 stones and gravel around it and things. And it's aesthetically, I think I certainly everybody responds to it as something special, beautiful because of the shape of the stones. And I think it's a long time ago, but I remember reading somebody had studied that physiologically. And there's something kind of almost built in that everybody sees that Zen garden as pleasing and pleasant. And it's something to do with our physiology, our anatomy, our brain anatomy, that it responds to that shape. And the artist just happened to, well, tune into that. And that goes for other Zen designs. They are seen that way. That makes me wonder, though, how you change that by explanation. I don't think you do. I think I would find that Zen garden would ever react to it pleasantly, thinking it's beautiful, even if it was explained that it was a symbol of evil or something else. It would still be beautiful for me. Whereas a Rothko painting, that doesn't happen. But is there not a kind of thing with aesthetics that's actually built in to our physiology that we respond to in that kind of beauty? And probably in music, I imagine sound will be, we respond to certain sounds in a way we find them beautiful, and discordant notes are discordant to everybody, however it's interpreted.
the whole discipline of neuroaesthetics. Recently got a book that I have not had much time to look into yet, but yes, there's a lot in what you say. Go back to Rothko. I mean, if you have to see his paintings firsthand. There's no use trying to look at a picture of them in a book or on a slide or anything like that. And you need peace and quiet. I mean, the last one I went to was a Rothko exhibition in the Tate Modern. It was a wet Sunday afternoon, and every family, this was their wet weather alternative. The place was full of kids running up and down, shouting and screaming. You really need peace and quiet to be able to stand there in front of this and just absorb the experience over a period of time. But yeah, I mean, some things don't need the kind of interpretation I've offered, and I suppose Roscoe's like that. There is an immediate experiential aspect to it as well. But in some cases, an explanation of content can change the whole way you look at something. And I quoted it earlier. Sometimes an interpretation, can transfer the experience of something that's disturbing or chaotic or confusing into something that that makes sense to me now. I understand what's going on, and that's what I tried to do with the picture by Bronzino.
Leonie.
Thank you. I'm a bit afraid to put on my microphone because it was making horrible noises earlier on. But anyway, here we are. Thanks, John. I'm trying to connect up some of these thoughts anyway with psychotherapy and what happens there. So I'm really not sure what I'm going to say, but I'm going to try and at least I'm not sure how it's all going to string together, but I was going to maybe carry on from what David was saying about relationships and what was the other you mentioned about aesthetics. Anyway, where I was going with that was just sticking with the relationship in psychotherapy. And what I think is particular about that is the uniqueness of each encounter, I guess. And for me, it would be the shared meaning that's achieved in that relational space. And whatever modality or way into that, it could be through creative and aesthetic things. It could be through anything really that's shared. But I think it's about that co-creation and that encounter that's unique, and the work that the sort of implicit relational work that needs to go on to get there. So it's not a struggle through the head, but it's a human encounter with painful experience and with, on one hand, and some knowledge about some modality of psychotherapy in the other, and then that co-created meeting, which to me, I think, well, I feel when it works, is aesthetic in itself, something unique and new and created there. So I'm not sure if that's making any sense to anybody, but that's what I'm thinking.
I think the idea of co-creation is a very interesting one. There's a German psychiatrist and psychotherapist called Rainer Holm-Hadula has written very interestingly on this, and he describes being in therapy and the patient will say something. This will provoke some image or some creation in his own mind, and he sort of uses that as a way of asking himself, well, why that? Why did this come into my mind? Why this image? What's this telling me about the patient? Sometimes he'll feed that back to the patient and they can work on it together to try and achieve understanding. So yeah, that kind of co-creation of new ideas, new links, new ways of thinking is potentially very interesting.
John, what was his name, the fellow you mentioned?
Rainer, Rainer,
Yeah.
and HOLM-HADULLA.
Thank you.
Back to your question, Gordon. Let's see if we see our reactions happen because of the substrate of our physiology.
just following from.
I think what's interesting is how our reactions can change with exposure. And one example, listening to a difficult piece of music. I mean, the first few listenings, you just don't get it at all. You don't like it that much, but the more you listen, the more you start to think about it, see it, and the whole experience changes in some way. And that can happen with other types of art as well, I think.
Isn't that one of Kant's points, that we're not born as blank slates, are we? We'll probably evolve to, what our physiology is we're already set to have language, and there's the software's already there or the hardware, to respond to the world. And it's maybe the same for aesthetics as well, But did Kant argue that we're, this idea that there's this innate, even in the baby before it develops a propensity towards a common aesthetic value, or that's maybe your universality, and
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, his work isn't universally accepted, and as I said at the beginning, people question whether he really achieved this overall aim that he set out to achieve. He was almost obsessional in his construction of arguments. He spoke about the architectonic of ideas, that everything had to form a coherent structure and fit together. And I think he often had to bend things into shape to make them fit the structure rather than being what's there. Another weakness he had was that he had no exposure to art at all. He probably never saw a great picture in his entire life. He probably never heard great music. He lived in his entire life in Königsberg in East Prussia, which is now Kaliningrad, and high European culture just didn't really extend that far to any extent.
Thinking of the Zen garden you mentioned, Douglas, is that the one where you can only see 14, and so there's a kind of point to it that you will never get the whole picture from moving around it, which I think is just beautiful. Our limitations basically are, you will not see the whole, however you strive, sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, and also it's probably linked to symmetry as well. I mean, they're not symmetrical, they're far from it. They're all juxtaposed, but they are juxtaposed in a particular way that just everybody finds that nice and pleasant. And the way that we like certain types of symmetry as well. We're kind of built to appreciate.
You had me thinking of Camus as well, because the Sisyphus pushing that boulder, and purposelessness without purpose, or whatever the phrase was. Purpose. Yeah, I can't say it, but it's just like that's what life is basically. We have to keep rolling that boulder. Yeah.
For the existentialists.
Of course.
Well, it's 20 past now, isn't it? So we're sort of coming towards the end of our time here. Can I just ask one question before we go? And then unless somebody's got another point, we'll bring it to a close. But it's about validity, John, about whether an aesthetic judgment is valid. And I suppose Kant brings his own view on that, and presumably says that you can have a certain level of validity. But whether you can bring that to a patient and say, well, the aesthetic judgment that's involved in the encounter with a patient can have validity, because not in the sort of logical, empirical ways that you outlined in the first bit of your presentation, but aesthetically.
I'm not sure I know how to answer that one, David. Anyone else got any thoughts on that? I mean, the whole validity of aesthetic judgment is to some extent based on this idea of common sensibility, Gemeinsinn,
Yes,
that we have
yes.
enough in common with our patients that what seems valid or meaningful to me should also seem valid and meaningful to
Yeah.
someone else.
But when the patient says that she's ugly and thin and, you know, all of those things, all of those things that you might, as a clinician, dispute.
Mhm.
I'm just, yeah, because I'm sure you're right about that this aesthetic judgment has a role to play. I'm sure it does, but it's like sort of finding its place in the work, not sidelining it into the sort of art therapy world, but centralizing it and saying that it's there. I think you know our patients are beautiful, and that's what keeps us going.
Okay, well, sometimes you convey that message not by, you know, what we say or what we do, but just by, you know, being punctual, being attentive, giving time and being there for the patient. And to some extent, I think the aesthetics of the places we work are important as well. You know, I think so much NHS psychiatry is just in shabby, down-at-heel accommodation. I think this gives a very poor message to people showing up that, you know, this place doesn't really care about you or the kind of person you are. The way we present ourselves in terms of our dress, deportment, giving messages out all the time.
Yes, that there is a beauty involved that we need to reclaim, don't we?